There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with something a little unusual. I have a creepy story for Halloween for you from the local history published about my hometown, Plenty, Saskatchewan, Canada. Here's the book, The Land of Plenty, 2007. My parents were involved in the committee that put this book together, and it's a great book that I treasure. I have my own little write-up in here and many write-ups on my family and neighbors and friends. Lots of photos. Oh, there's my parents' wedding picture. Look at that. But what I wanted to share with you was part of an article that's at the beginning of the book by a woman. I have no idea who she is. She doesn't live in my hometown anymore. She's only identified as Ms. McLean. And these are her memories of Plenty, Saskatchewan in the 19-teens, 1920s. And there's a story in here that seems like it should come straight out of a novel or a creepy Halloween anthology. It's not supernatural, but it is creepy. And if you don't like hearing about corpses, maybe you don't want to listen. It's absolutely incredible. I hate Halloween and everything about it, especially ghost stories. But this is incredible. Sit back and listen to this. So I believe the story begins in about 1914 and carries on. Mr. Sexton was the first man to print a weekly paper, the Plenty Planet. He stayed for several years, then moved on after selling all his holdings, building, press, and all the other equipment. I believe Mr. Deutschmann was the purchaser. Not much was known about Mr. Deutschmann, except that his parents were quite poor and resided in Prince Edward Island. He was an excellent printer, but unfortunately for him, he was also a very heavy drinker. He and a young man, a clerk in the hardware store across the street, used the back room of the building for a bedroom. They could eat all of their meals at the nearby Chinese cafe. The clerk rode home to visit for several days, expecting to be back late Sunday or early Monday. In the meantime, Deutschmann became very ill with pneumonia and was taken to the new hospital where he died either Saturday or Sunday. The corpse was carried over to the bedroom and placed on one of the two beds. No casket could be ordered until Monday, and it would come from either Kerrobert or Rosetown, two slightly larger nearby towns. The clerk arrived back in town quite late, stabled his horse in the livery barn, and then let himself into the bedroom. Not wanting to waken Deutschmann, he undressed in the dark and crawled into his bed, where the corpse had been laid. I will leave it to your imagination as to what his reaction would have been. Deutschmann was a very large man with a very large nose. They had difficulty fitting his body into the casket, and I recall seeing his nose above the edge of the casket at the funeral. His was the third grave on the hill. A fence had been built around the graves to keep horses and cattle from trampling on them. These graves were on CPR land, and in 1922, I will just interject here, 1922 was the year my grandparents married and moved to Plenty and began their farming life there. And in 1922, the village council was ordered to have them move to the cemetery, which by then had been surveyed. Jack Armstrong, my uncle, a carpenter by trade but idle at the time, contracted to move the three graves. Dad decided to help him. The teachers forbade the pupils to go up the hill to view the bodies, but as soon as the teachers left for lunch, all commands were disobeyed, and the kids were up the hill as fast as they could run. Their return was a bit different. Some had lost their lunch and others could not eat at all. The homemade rough box and casket made for Mr. Cool was intact, and the corpse looked as one would expect it to look. When the air reached inside the baby's grave, clothes and all disintegrated and blew away in the wind. Only a tiny skull, small enough to fit into a teacup, was left. The shock, or big surprise, came from Deutschmann's grave. When the outside air reached it, casket and clothes disintegrated and blew away in the wind. Only the casket handles and a corpse that had turned to stone was left in the grave hole. Dad and Uncle Jack had a difficult time getting the mummified body out. They used leather straps and ropes to haul it up, but the most difficult part was to move the body enough to get the straps beneath it. The naked body lay in the open air, and a diamond ring glittered in the sunshine. Uncle Jack hit his spade against the body, and the result was a ringing sound. I thought he was very callous. Wilfred Corneille, one of the older students at the time — I remember Wilfred Corneille as a very old man in church, in the pews at church on Sunday morning — Wilfred Corneille, one of the older students at the time, reminded me recently that Dad got a great big old bone from the butcher and told the kids it was one he had dug up. He enjoyed playing jokes on the kids. The stone figure was placed in a new casket built by Uncle Jack, and he and Mr. Cool were interred in the approved grounds. No one knows what happened to the Radcliffe baby's remains. It is noted in the Plenty Cemetery records that Mr. Cool and Mr. Deutschman are buried in paupers' graves. It seems rather sad and cruel that their final resting place is designated as such. Happy Halloween!